It is my honor, my privilege to have with us again the author of this book, Alexis in America, Lee Farrow, Dr. Lee Farrow at Auburn University in Montgomery, Alabama. And we're concluding now the fourth in a series of talks, dialogues about Alexis, the Grand Duke, the fourth son of Alexander II, and the brother of the Alexander III, he was the father of Nicholas II, right?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay.
Last
And so
czar.
he was the last czar. So it's kind of interesting that since we've done this last one, things have gotten a little hot and heavy in that part of the world.
Yeah.
And you having been to Russia a number of times, I'm sure you've made friends there. And so I think it's kind of appropriate in a way that we're talking about this because in my mind, at least, not being a Russian expert or anything, although I can say that I was born within a half-mile of the East German border. Fortunately, I was on the western side of the border, not the eastern side of the border. Otherwise, I'd probably be speaking French or, speaking German at this point. So that the event that we're talking about, the what I call the Royal Buffalo Hunt of 1872, and that visit that Alexis made here over the course of 3 months?
Yes, it was a 3-month trip. Mm-hmm.
Right. At least in my view, given the history of relations with Russia, was in some respects, in my mind, the high watermark of good, positive relations with the Russian people. Is that kind of how you see it?
Yes. And, it's interesting. Yesterday, I was talking with somebody about this, that, the United States and Russia, and this is something that, this is where I've focused all of my energies over the last decade or more. The United States and Russia have always had a relationship much, much farther back than most people even realize. People are very aware of the Cold War, but they don't think much about the relationship prior to that.
Right.
But we did have a relationship with them, and we had a really good relationship with them for quite a while in the 19th century. And this visit was really kind of a high point. I mean, we just bought Alaska from Russia a couple of years prior to this. Russia had liberated its serfs. We had liberated our slaves. Lincoln and Alexander II were favorably compared, and then suddenly, the Tsar's son comes to visit, and it's celebrated as this wonderful sign of the friendship between these two nations. And for the most part, the visit went very well. There were some snags along the way, but for the most part, the visit went very well, and the Grand Duke seemed to have a pretty good time while he was here, despite some, heartache and a few other things.
Yeah.
But and the American people, despite some self-examination regarding, what we were doing, fawning over royalty.
Yeah. We're going to talk about that some more.
Yeah, the American people had a good opinion of Alexis, and it was widely viewed as a very positive moment between Russia and the United States.
Absolutely.
And I will say, I think it's our relationship with Russia has ebbed and flowed over the years, and I think that what's happening now is another example of that. And we always need to remember that there's a difference between what the Russian government is doing and the Russian people themselves. There are certainly, I'm sure, many Russian people who support Putin, but there are certainly those who don't. And I think it's hard for people to recognize this, but those of us who study Russia can both love Russia, its history and its culture, and appreciate all of those things about it that we have studied and really enjoyed for so many years, and separate that from the current political agenda of the regime right now.
Yeah, it's it seems like they really can't. I mean, I feel for the Ukrainian people. Obviously, I have a remote history to that part of the world because my mother's brother died, oddly enough, defending, if you want to put it that way, defending the Ukraine from the Russians, although he was defending it on behalf of a Nazi regime back in Berlin, Germany, rather than for the people of Kiev. But I feel bad for the fact that the Russian people have had to put up, pardon my French, with this bullshit for so many years, decades, centuries, you know. It's a system that they just apparently they get little brief windows of opportunity to see democracy and to have a chance to escape this system, and then, you know, whether it be you know, Tsarist Russia cracking down on its dissidents, you know, or the you know, Stalinists, or the current administration there, you know, they just don't seem to catch a break. And I've been watching this war porn, I hate to say it, you know, of tanks getting blown up and helicopters being shot down. And the most recent one of the Hind helicopter flying across a farm field and gets hit by a missile, and then catapults, or I guess that's the word, you know, does somersaults and then crashes in a fiery ball. And said, man, there's two young men, you know, incinerated, gone, their lives forever, you know, forever lost. And then so I feel as much for the Ukrainians as I do, you know, for the Russians that got, you know, pulled into this thing, just like my uncle, you know, he was a young kid, 17 years of age, you know, goes off and joins the, you know, the Waffen SS and becomes a member of a tank crew, and, you know, gives his life too. So,
well, and also, you know, from the perspective of historians, right, we worry what's being destroyed during all of this. I mean, aside from the horrific human losses, which are, you know, just unimaginable, right? We have to worry about, like, what architecture is being destroyed, what documents are being destroyed, are the beautiful churches of Ukraine being destroyed? And those are, you know, those are things that are important as well. I mean, it's all a great tragedy, and it's terrible what's happening there. And it's as I said, it's, you know, it's terrible for anyone who's interested in these countries from a cultural and a historical perspective, and who wants to kind of leave politics out of it as much as possible. You know, it's really difficult to separate all those things. And those of us who would like to go and do our research in that part of the world are probably not going to be going there anytime soon. And so, yeah, it's just horrible all around.
I was mentioning my mother's brother. And so my younger brother wrote the German War Graves Commission and said, could you identify, you know, any idea, you know, what became of this young man? And they said, well, you know, they sent us a letter saying, here's where we're fairly certain, you know, he was buried. And we were going to go there and recover those bodies and give them a proper burial. He says, but we can't, because it's, you know, it's a conflict zone. We can't get there. So, you know, I always sort of hoped, well, it'd be kind of cool to be able to go over there and you know, see that area. And, you know, probably not in my lifetime is going to happen, unfortunately. So anyway, all right. So we've talked about that. And I must add, we started watching Servant of the People. I don't know. That you really get a sense of the city of Kiev you can't get from watching news coverage of blown up buildings and things. I mean, that is, or was, however it ends up, an absolutely beautiful city, you know. And there's this, what is the Dnieper River? Dnieper River that flows through, and there's yacht basins and big, beautiful buildings and stuff. And to think now, you know, this was done, I think they did that between 2015 and 2019. And it's almost like it's so prescient. And so I don't know if you've seen any of the episodes, but episode 4, he has to walk in and talk down and talk out the previous president because the previous president didn't want to leave. Wow. And
Yeah.
there are constant references to Putin and things in there. And so I can almost see why Putin, would like to get his hands on this guy or see an end to him, because they made such a mockery of what was going on politically, within the government and things. So if people listening to this haven't seen it, if you've got Netflix, I really encourage you to watch it, because it's really well done, and it's just so eye-opening to see this big, beautiful, modern, gleaming city, and now it's just slowly being pulverized. It's just it's so sad. All right, so we got the Grand Duke out of the Nebraska wilderness where he was hunting bison. We've got him to Denver, Colorado, does some ballroom dancing there, goes and does a few other little social things, goes on one more buffalo hunt, then hops on a train and heads back east. And he goes, I think they go through Topeka and Kansas City and finally end up in St. Louis. From there, then he goes to Louisville. So let's kind of pick up the story of Louisville to Memphis, and then Memphis down to New Orleans, and then the rest of his trip.
So the last part of his trip, what I referred to as the southern leg, was I think much more placid. The events were, he still was being celebrated, but I think just on, in general, the events tended to be a little bit smaller in scale. Yeah. You get the feel that maybe this last part of the visit was a little more relaxed in nature. Especially when you think about them kind of going down the Mississippi River on a boat at one point.
Right.
But yeah, so he starts in Louisville, Kentucky, and he does, of course, a lot of the typical things that you would expect in Louisville. He goes around the city and he sees a number of historical sites, which are still there today. The famous clock tower of City Hall and the Cave Hill Cemetery and a number of other places. He meets the founder of Churchill Downs, essentially.
Yes. Yeah. Right. Yep.
So this is the beginning. Horse racing was already something that was important in Kentucky at the time, and horse breeding, and so he meets the
great grandson
of
Meriwether Lewis, right?
Yes. And who becomes involved in creating the first major horse racing track there. So yeah, I just actually finished editing an article about this particular little segment of the visit. There was a lot of, and this is interesting because it talks about this reflection of Americans about like what their role was in hosting the Grand Duke. In Kentucky, there was a lot of talk about, the reception and chivalry and, their role as being good hosts, because this was something that was perceived as being part of that Southern genteel culture.
Right. Yeah.
And so there were debates about, whether or not they should host the Grand Duke and how and who would pay for it. But, ultimately the point was raised that this was part of their reputation as being very receptive to people, very good hosts, and it was something that they should do. And then from there, he makes his way down to Mammoth Cave.
Right.
And so that's a huge part of the visit as well. And the Grand Duke and his entourage actually do go inside the cave, and they do walk around inside the cave. They spend a couple of hours there.
And have a hard time getting through a couple of the narrowest parts, apparently.
Yeah. And it was, this was one of the few things I mentioned in the book that, Alexis only wrote this one letter to his mom in which he actually comments on things in the trip specifically.
Right.
And this is one of the things that he actually does comment on. He says that it was kind of, terrifying to be there.
Yeah.
And so but they do go to Mammoth Cave, and then they go on to Memphis, Tennessee.
They do that
Um,
by rail. I was thinking they would have gone down the Mississippi, but they actually
they were still traveling by
ride by
rail at
rail
that
down to
point.
Memphis.
Mhm.
And
And
they
they go
spent, he
down.
spent, don't they, what was that famous hotel with the ducks?
So it's the Peabody.
Peabody, that's right.
And yeah, unfortunately, as is the case with so many of the places Alexis stayed at the time, the actual original Peabody is no longer in existence.
Right.
The Peabody that currently stands there is a newer building. And I did actually go there and see if they had anything, did they have anything in an archive someplace from the older Peabody, and they didn't. The hotel was unaware actually of the Grand Duke's visit.
Yeah.
For the most part. But yeah, so he stayed at the Peabody, which is now famous for the ducks who stay in the penthouse. And that part of the visit was interesting. Also, he and his guardian, Admiral Possiet, met Jefferson Davis, the former president of the Confederacy. Yeah, who by this point had been pardoned. And it again, Possiet, for the most part, his comments in his own writings about the trip focused on logistical things, kind of describing to the Tsar what was going on, especially focusing on Alexis's well-being and Alexis's moods and so on. But Admiral Possiet did actually say, that Jefferson Davis was a nice guy, and that it was sort of hard to imagine that he'd been on the wrong side of things in the previous war. In Memphis, they toured some places as they had in other cities, such as a jail and the Cotton Exchange and these kinds of places. And again, just for those who have been watching the other segments, along the way with these various social events, there were these kinds of events that, tours that had to do more with kind of industry and education and even, what would you call that? Like sort of what would you call, how would you refer to a prison?
Chamber of Commerce type things.
Yeah, and Alexis was interested in these things. The cities, of course, were eager to show off the things that they had to boast about, but he was interested in these things, and he, in many places, took home blueprints or requested samples or things like that. So he did the same in Memphis. And then from Memphis is when he got on a steamboat and went down the Mississippi to New Orleans. And by this leg of the trip, actually from Kentucky down, they were accompanied by both George Armstrong Custer and his wife, Libby Custer.
Yeah.
And so Libby wrote a bit about this, and Libby said that she had been she'd been requested to recruit some lovely young Louisville, Kentucky girls to travel with them down the Mississippi River. And she talks about, Alexis being kind of gaga over the girls. And I'm sure, as I've said previously, I'm sure he enjoyed himself, and as did all the other, men traveling with him. But he was still very much in love with somebody else. So these girls would have been what we would call today maybe eye candy.
At the end here.
Yeah. But they do describe, having a really nice, a nice trip down the Mississippi River. And then eventually Alexis ends up in New Orleans. And again, this is this is probably the second most known part of his visit. So Alexis's role in the Mardi Gras of 1872 is widely known in New Orleans. It is included in a lot of popular histories of Mardi Gras, and it appears almost without fail every single year during Mardi Gras season. There will be some mention of Alexis in a newspaper article or something like that, and even in the annual Mardi Gras guides that are published. I've written a whole article about this. Alexis did not start Mardi Gras. They did not create Mardi Gras for him. Mardi Gras was already in existence for a long time, but it was coincidentally the year that local businessmen decided to kind of organize Mardi Gras with a small o. and to hold a daytime celebration. This had normally been a nighttime celebration, and now they kind of want to bring a little bit of order to it. It was always a bit of a raucous kind of event, and they wanted it to be a little more orderly, and they were thinking about tourism because now at this stage, people were actually starting to travel to New Orleans for Mardi Gras, and so they were thinking about tourism and money making, and so they decided to create a Mardi Gras organization and a king of Mardi Gras, who then issued decrees about where people were supposed to gather and how they were supposed to behave, and that was the birth of the crew of Rex.
Right. How did Rex? I could understand Rex being Latin, isn't it, for king or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Crew, KRE.
KREWE is the spelling. And that word had been around prior to to the crew of Rex. Yeah. But even though it was a lovely coincidence that Alexis's trip happened to coincide with this, it did make for a very special Mardi Gras season that year, because Alexis was present at some Mardi Gras events. He also, of course, had participated in balls and theater visits and so on. But
how long was he there?
Excuse me?
How long was he there?
A couple of days.
Days. Okay.
Yep. Yep. So, and he did make a visit to the racetrack there. That's another kind of theme of his visit, the interest in racetracks.
Were they doing the sort of traditional jockey on the back, or were they doing the trotter?
As far as I know, the jockeys were riding.
Okay. All right.
Yeah. But yeah, so his visit in New Orleans was also a great success. And it did give birth to this myth that, Alexis helped create Mardi Gras, and also the myth that he had followed the reason he ended up in New Orleans is because he was following a burlesque performer there. She was part of a troupe called the British Blondes. And Alexis had seen her earlier in his travels in the United States and had given her a rather lavish bracelet. And so the press had made much of this and implied that he had a crush on her.
Right.
In fact, as I said, we know he had his heart was elsewhere, but also he had given some rather lavish gifts to other performers, male and female, during his travels. Right. So that was not unique to her, but it did, sort of fan the flames of this kind of, media frenzy about Alexis seeking a woman while he was here. And so it gave birth to the idea that Alexis had traveled to New Orleans specifically to follow her. That gave birth to the rumor that the song that is the theme song of the crew of Rex, which is If Ever I Cease to Love, was selected specifically because it was a song in her performance of Bluebeard. Yeah. Now, in reality, if you go back and look at the newspapers from the time, and I did, right, this was a very popular song. And so people knew it, and people had made parodies of it, changing the words. And so there are lots of reasons that people would have been aware of this song and would have wanted to choose it as a theme song for Rex that had nothing to do with Alexis.
Yeah. Yeah.
So a lot of the myths surrounding the birth of Rex and its association to Alexis are simply untrue, but it makes for such a great story that every year these same stories appear in various places, even though, as I said, I published an article trying to debunk the whole thing. The true story is just not as
interesting. It's hard once a myth takes hold, it's hard to debunk, particularly one as romantic.
Yes, exactly.
This would be.
Exactly.
So from Memphis, he goes to Mobile.
He makes a very brief stop in Mobile. And he doesn't do anything while he's there. I mean, it really is just a stop. And even some of the local, press commented on this. They were a little bit miffed that he seemed to kind of just pass them over. And then he continued on to Florida, and that's where he met the Russian fleet, which
Yeah, he
had
was
sailed around
Pensacola, I think, wasn't it?
Pensacola. Mhm.
Yeah.
And then from that point they continue on, and Alexis spends, so we're talking February of 1872. Alexis then spends almost another year and a half sailing. So they go to Cuba and Brazil, and they go to India and Singapore and Japan and China. And all along the way, Alexis is pining for this woman, which we'll talk about in a moment.
Right.
And he finally gets back to Russia in July of 1873, after being gone almost 2 whole years.
Yeah.
Which is really rough. I mean, I think I mentioned in one of the earlier segments, that Alexis was 20 when he started this trip, or 21. And I mean, 21. And you just have to feel sorry for him. And that's a really long time to be away from your family. And he does talk about that in some of his letters to his relatives. He says things like, it's Christmas time, and, normally I would be with family. And, he comments on this distance from his family at holiday times and that sort of thing. I mean, you feel kind of sorry for him.
Yeah. Well, he was handed what he was handed. And what I want to do too, I want to talk about is sort of a summary of his life. But the interesting thing about that voyage, going down around the Cape of Good Hope, up to India, through the Straits of Malacca, Singapore, up to Japan and things, that is almost the same route that the Baltic Sea Fleet took to sail against the Japanese, that led to the famous battle that was essentially the beginning of the end of the Romanov dynasty. And we can maybe chat about that a little bit. So this whole time he's been apart, he still has this thing. What do we know that's happening with Alexandra during that period while he's gone?
So she gives birth. Yeah, that happens right when he arrives in the United States.
Right.
Eventually she leaves Russia. She goes to what has just recently become Germany.
Okay.
She eventually meets someone and gets married there, and she starts raising Alexis's child in Germany.
Right.
In the meantime, we do know that he has arranged, with the help of his brother, to have a portion of his inheritance given to her to help support her and his son. So even though his parents would not allow him to marry her, he did appeal to his father to kind of take an advance on his inheritance so that he could take care of them.
Right.
But she does remarry. But throughout that period, until July of 1873, it is still unclear that they are not going to try. I mean, this doesn't happen right away. So, at first there is still a great fear on the part of the royal family that he and Alexandra might try and meet up someplace. And so Admiral Posset has writes to the Tsar regularly that he is monitoring this. Right. He monitors all of Alexis's correspondence in and out.
Yeah, he goes to some extremes, actually, from what I read, what you wrote. Yeah. To make sure that if we know she's in this port, we're not landing.
Yeah.
Keep going.
He assures the Tsar that if he gets wind of her being in any one of these ports, then they'll just sail past the port, because there was such a fear that they were going to run off and get married.
Yeah.
And I will say, and we can touch on this again later, the rumor or the belief within the family, the descendants of Alexis's line, is that they did manage to get married. So really? all the heirs to Grand Duke Alexis believe that they are legitimate. They believe that they did manage to get married.
Now, are any of that? Well, I assume then that there are descendants that are alive then.
I interviewed one. She said she was the only one who was really kind of interested in the story, because I asked her if, if her relatives were as well. And she said, no, not really. And she was the only one who had any kind of family possessions. She had a portrait of Zhukovskaya. But yeah, she said that the family belief is that they did manage to get married somehow.
Oh,
So
was this before she married the German
yes,
nobleman?
yes,
Okay, so
because yeah, so there's no proof of
interesting.
that. There's no proof of that, but
Yeah.
but they believe it. So yeah, so Alexis sailed around the world basically, and then came back to Russia in July of 1873.
I assume what Trans-Siberian Railway, I assume, was completed by this time.
No, I don't think that would have been
So he
completed
took a
by that
steamer
point.
back?
Sorry.
So he took a steamer back
Yes.
from
Yeah.
China, wherever he was?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, because the rail line wouldn't have been completed then. And then he, he goes back to court life. He serves in a variety of positions within the government, and then eventually he is made the head of the Imperial Navy.
Yeah.
But he doesn't have a great reputation for being terribly interested in his job.
So you have one quote in there, allegedly, he was more interested in fast women than slow ships or something like
Yeah,
that.
that he liked fast women and slow ships.
And shows
And there were jokes that, every time he had a new girlfriend, that, sort of there went another Russian ship, because he would spend so much money on the women in his life. So he never married, but he always had a woman on his arm. And he didn't, I mean, he has several relationships that were long. It's not like he had a different woman every day, but he had a number of relationships, and he spent a great deal on them. There are some amazing jewelry pieces, which there are photographs of, that and some that still exist, and that have actually been auctioned off in recent years, and particularly a beautiful peacock feather necklace that was made by the jewelry company Boucheron in France. But he never married. Eventually, and this part of the story is a little fuzzy. It was hard to find details on this, but eventually his son, who was also named Alexis, does make his way back to Russia. And
this is his son by Alexandra.
Yes.
His mistress.
Yes. The only child that we know of.
Yeah.
That child, so Alexis Jr., if we want to say that, sort of makes his way back to Russia, and he is embraced by the royal family. He's kind of brought into the fold. And in fact, that Alexis gets married and has children eventually. And Empress Alexandra, the last Empress of Russia, Nicholas II's wife, was the godmother of one of his children.
Yeah. And
his children played with the younger children in the palace. So there's, eventually, Alexis does get to have his son back in Russia, but at that point it's unclear how much interaction they have, how much connection they have, because the senior Alexis lives in Russia until 1905. And then at the end of the disastrous Russo-Japanese War, he resigns from the, as the admiral of the Imperial Navy. And at that point, he moves to Paris, where he lives for 3 years until he dies in 1908.
Yeah.
So, so it's unclear how much interaction Alexis had with his son, but it is at least nice to know that his son was kind of accepted and brought back into the fold of the Romanov family.
Right. Now, of course, that 10 years later, in 1918 and that particular time frame, all that begins to fall apart. Did I guess the descendants were able to then get out, or are they still still Russian citizens.
Yeah, I mean, so many members of the Romanov family were killed, but some did manage to get out. Yeah. So, but Alexis dies in 1908 in Paris of kidney failure. So it appears, so he died of more or less natural causes, probably a hard life of too much drinking. He had a reputation for partying in Paris. But
they still give tours or something, don't
well, it's said at some point they still did. I don't know if those still exist, but sort of the Grand Duke's tours of the sort of the demi-monde. But in dying in 1908, he was at least spared the ravages of the Russian Revolution. So the house that he lived in Paris is now a building that houses some businesses and apartments, but you can find it. It still exists.
Oh, it's still there then.
As does his palace in, outside of St. Petersburg.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, so his life kind of ends in a sort of a sad way. He's sort of in self-imposed exile after the disaster of the Russo-Japanese War.
Do they, after that period of time, does he still continue to maintain sort of communication with Alexandra, or is that pretty well?
I did not find any kind of correspondence between her and him. So I don't know. Like I said, I wasn't even really able to discover how much interaction he had with his own son. At what and at what point that resulted in the move back to Russia. So I'm not sure about any of that. None of that was included in the correspondence that I could find.
If you're looking back at his life, if you were to say what do you think meant the most to him in his life, where would this trip to America and the buffalo hunt and meeting Bill Cody and George Custer and the Indians and things, where would that fall in this spectrum of this interesting, varied life that he had?
I think it would be probably pretty high up there, because he did maintain contact with some of these people afterwards. He sent gifts afterwards. He did actually return to the United States very, very briefly in 1877, something that I still have yet to write about, but it was a visit that ended up being truncated because Russia ended up at war with the Ottoman Empire.
Oh yeah.
But so this was when Rutherford B. Hayes was president. He did come to the United States again very briefly. He was in Virginia and Washington, D.C. But before he really got to do much of anything, the visit, as I said, was truncated. So I think he had a fondness for the United States, and I think that visit was probably pretty spectacular. It seems that after he came here, his life became just sort of the drudgery of work. I mean, he had to take up offices and work within the government, and many people commented that he never really seemed passionate about the work he was doing. So
if he hadn't been saddled with the responsibilities of the imperial family, that came with a certain burden of, just like the English royal family, there's not a lot you can do productively except attend performances and appear at various events. But at least, was there anything that you think that sort of was a productive outcome of his life?
I don't know. I sort of got the feeling that he reminds me of what's characterized in the 19th century in Russian literature as the superfluous man. And it's sort of someone who is educated and has abilities, but has really no outlet for those things, because in literature, it's always sort of the rich noble who has all this education, but because he's rich and the government really has no role for him, he just spends his time kind of getting into trouble. And Alexis did not seem to have a passion for governing, for government, for, any of those kinds of things. And so I don't know what his passion would have been had he been free to pursue something different. He seemed to have some ennui that never really went away. I think had he been able to marry Alexandra, there would have been a chance for happiness there. But, as we spoke of in a previous segment, I mean, he wasn't allowed to do that because she wasn't royalty.
Yeah.
He could, if he'd have just married somebody else, if he'd have just fulfilled his duty and married somebody else, he could have lived a whole life with her. He could have had her as a mistress on the side. He could have eventually perhaps even married her after his appropriate wife died or something.
Right. And his parents passed on.
But he didn't want to do that, even though that was not an uncommon thing to do. Many, including his father, had mistresses right on the side that in the public eye. And had children with them. He could have done that, but he didn't want to do that. And I'm sure that was just sort of youthful romantic notions about what love is, right? I mean, like at 21, he didn't want to settle for that arrangement because he thought he wanted her to be his proper wife.
Right.
Had he just compromised, he might have had more of the life he wanted. Who knows?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, looking at his interest in industry and patents and blueprints and things, I'm wondering if he might have, been able to, pursue a career of, I guess, what we would call maybe an entrepreneur or an industrialist or something along that line. If he just simply been, given that opportunity.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah. Well, he had an interesting life. It was unfortunately short, relatively short.
Yeah, 58.
Given his obvious vigor as a young man and stamina out here on the Great Plains. So it's an interesting. I am so glad that I had a chance that you wrote it, and I had a chance to read it. I keep thinking about, God, this would make a great mini series.
So from your mouth to Ken Burns' ears.
Yes.
I mean, or Lin-Manuel Miranda. I mean, Hamilton the musical, going to Alexis the musical. If somebody out there has connections,
well, that's not me, unfortunately, but who knows? Somebody listening might.
Yeah, it's such a great story, and it's filled with so many colorful people. It's at this particularly fun point in American history and Russian history when so much is happening. And I mean, it's such a great story. I just hope at some point somebody wants to pick it up and do something like that with it.
This would be a beautiful segue, I guess, after we get past this disaster in the Ukraine, and we will, but at what toll and price, of human life and, property and things, but we'll get past it. And I'm thinking, there needs to be some way to rebuild, and reach a hand out to not only the Ukrainian people, but also the Russian people, because like I said, they just haven't had a break. Every time you turn around, the Tsar had his secret police, and that got picked up by, Stalin and his crew, and it just perpetuated, and of course led to this little, pardon my French, this little shit, by the name of Putin. It's just, they need it. They all of them, that part of the world, need a break, and some of those former, Soviet territories are getting that opportunity. So we'd like to see it. Maybe there'd be, it would be a better world, for all if it were. So thank you so much for taking the time and doing this. This has been fun. I don't know where this will go, whether somebody will pick this up, like say, pick this up as a movie or a musical or whatever it is. But it really is a great story. I mean, I'd like to see the same thing done with Sir Thomas Lipton's story. Lipton tea. Yeah. About the same period of time, and they sort of, I think, could have crossed paths at some point. But Lipton's got a fabulously interesting story too. Particularly,
I think it's always so fun when you find these interesting stories in history, because we feel like, we know everything about history.
Right.
And then there are always these new stories that come out. Every time, somebody discovers some amazing new story from World War II, I'm amazed, because you feel like that's just been picked over so thoroughly.
Yeah.
But there are so many stories that are still out there that are yet to be told and could be made into movies and documentaries and books. And so it's always fun when somebody finds a really good story and brings history to life.
Yeah, absolutely.
In a way
Well,
that everybody.
I wanted to do my parents' life, because they, under the circumstances under which they met and in post-war Germany and things, that it's an interesting story too. I actually wrote a screenplay about it, but I'm not a very good screenplay writer. So Lee, Dr. Farrow, thank you so much for taking the time and talking to us. I've loved this. I hope we continue to keep up the correspondence and communication. Maybe at some point I'll get a chance to come to Auburn and watch a football game or whatever. So, but anyway, I really thank you for your time and all the energy you put into this. So
absolutely.
All righty. Toodaloo. Oh, how do I say goodbye in Russian?
До свидания.
До свидания.
Until our next meeting.
By the way, before we go, what's the difference between the Ukrainian and Russian? Because they look very similar.
They do look similar, and usually Russians and Ukrainians can understand one another for the most part. But there are significant variations. So some of the words might be the same or sound the same. So you might hear some familiar roots, but you can't really, but it's a different language. So I have heard Ukrainian. I can pick out words here and there.
Yeah.
I'm sure if I was a native Russian speaker, I would be able to understand more, but it is a completely different language.
Right. Cool.
Yeah. And there were efforts on the part of the Russians, way back to try and crush the Ukrainian language. And, so
as always.
Yeah. So that's part of this whole struggle of Ukrainian independence here.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Great. Thank you so much.
All righty. Bye-bye.
Okay. Bye-bye.